so good to be here with all of you today. I want to talk about this whole idea of reinvention. Here's my belief, and when this kind of topic came up, I started to think about, my journey. And I actually think that life is just a constant state of reinvention. It truly is. And we have a choice of how that's going to play out, because reinvention equals, to me, it equals progress, it equals growth. Put it the other way around. If you want growth, if you want progress in life, then it's going to require us to reinvent ourselves, and it doesn't have to be some crazy go in a cocoon and sprout out a butterfly kind of perspective, but it can, because I think that our reinvention can be one of two ways. It can be evolutionary, incremental, if you will, or it can be revolutionary. I mean, a huge jump. And I'll give you some for instances, because I think that this is important for us to understand that there are triggers that will cause us to reinvent ourselves. And those triggers can simply be something like choice, okay? Choosing to do something. When I was working for the big consulting firm in downtown Los Angeles, I realized I was miserable. I realized I was living someone else's life. And so I made a choice. I walked in and I quit. I said, I'm done. I'm out of here. I'm not doing this anymore. It was choice. Okay. Another trigger could be events. We had the pandemic. I had cancer. It could be a marriage. It could be a birth of a child or a grandchild. It could be a breakup. There are events in our life that allow us to start to look at things and say, I need to re-examine. And I'm going to give you a framework to walk through this, because when I look back on my moments of reinvention throughout life, there's a pattern. There's a pattern in a process that I've used throughout, whether it's recovering from the Ponzi scheme or anything else. I think that there's a pattern and a process to use and make it happen. Now, one of the things to realize is interesting. Joan put retirement. It is an event in life. Here's an interesting thing from a guy who talks money. Most of my work is to help people create wealth, to create financial freedom, to give them the affluence way. Here's the interesting thing. When we transition to retirement and we're starting to try and spend that wealth, man, so many people have a hard time with it. There's a reinvention point right there in doing that. The other thing that can trigger reinvention is health. Many of you know that in 2019, I was diagnosed with bladder cancer, and I'm happy to say I'm 2 years clear and clean after 3 surgeries, 4 tumors, and 43 treatments. But I remember as I spiraled down into the despair, the darkness, the blame, the search for, why did I get cancer? No one in my family had cancer. I wasn't a drinker. I wasn't a smoker. I didn't have the risk factors. Why did this happen to me? What is it that happened to me? And many of us may be looking at our current circumstances and looking for a place to blame, and looking for a place to point the finger, to look for the why, if you will. And people a lot of times talk about that why. Here's what I realized. The more I spent time looking backwards in my past to try and find the reason for the cancer, the darker, the more despair, and the more I spiraled down. And it wasn't until I said to myself and asked the question, what if the reason for the cancer isn't behind me, but it's in front of me? What if my why is yet to be defined? Now that empowers me, and that gives me the opportunity to look at it through a different eyes. But in there was a moment of reinvention, a moment of examination, and a process where we need to intentionally integrate what we do. I think about this whole thing from this perspective. We're a pound of clay, and we're outside of ourselves. We're the sculptor, and we get a chance to chip away the things that we don't want and to leave the things that we choose to have. And that's where reinvention comes from. So here's the thing, as I think one of the first things that we need to bring into our into our place, there's three things that it takes. And the first is awareness. If I'm truly not aware of what's going on, and I'm just kind of going through life, we got in a boat, we're on a current, we don't have rudders, we don't have oars, and we're just floating. We're just floating. The problem is that we then end up, like Bronnie Ware said in her book, The 7 Regrets of Dying. One of the biggest regrets was living someone else's life. So we end up living a life that wasn't meant for us. And so what ends up happening is that I think ultimately, if we're not careful here, you end up in a situation where you're living life, and this might be confronting for some of you, but the empowering thing is that with that, it gives you the control back. We might be living life oblivious. We might be living life mildly miserable. I remember a dear friend of mine who got in a car accident. He got hit by a car and he had a hip problem. He was in the martial arts with me, and he lived with the pain in his hip for decades. And then all of a sudden he went and had a surgery, not a hip replacement, but a special surgery. And he didn't walk out, but after he started walking, he looked at me and he said, I had no idea how much pain I got used to. And how many of us, we get used to what's going on in life and we get used to the pain. It's just our existence and we just keep going. Whereas what ends up happening is that there's two things that I think will help us pass through this phase. And the first is this, is to make sure that you come at it with this idea of curiosity, with that child's mind to say, I'm just curious. I love the question of what if it were possible? What if it was possible? What if it were possible for you to have $1 million a year? What if it was possible for you to live a vibrant and healthy life? What if it was possible for you to have a wonderful, loving relationship? Because in the end, it is. And when it is, you need to do the second thing, and that is to make a decision.
Reinvention, man, what a big word. And when I found out that this was the topic for this month, I was just thinking, gosh, how many of us are in this life stage, in this phase, this season of life where we're wondering, what does it look like to reinvent? And more importantly, am I in need for one? And as I was preparing for today, I always just love to look up what is the definition. And reinvent literally means to change the way that you behave and the things that you do so that people think of you as a different person. And I love Merriam-Webster, but I also wanted to push back on that thought and to really challenge ourselves about what do we think about ourselves? It's not necessarily what do people think about us, but how can we think about ourselves in a different way? And I found this amazing article about reinvention by someone named Karen Merrick. And it says, here's the thing about reinvention. And I want for you to listen to this before we dive on in. Some believe that it is tossing out the old or your previous roles and experiences or even work identity and exchanging it for something completely new. But that simply is not true. And this is why this is good news. The best power of a reinvention lies in leveraging every single thing you have ever done. We're talking the good, the bad, the ugly, the successes, the failures. Reinvention literally taps into the very real and often underappreciated or unarticulated skills, insights, and expertise that you have gained along the way. So it's not necessarily about creating a whole new you. It's about leaning on everything that you've ever been through, everything that life has taught you, and moving forward. And I recently shared this idea as a recent mother. Again, there's this whole theology around bouncing back for moms. I hate the terminology, because once you become a mother or once you birth a child, there's really no going backwards, right? We want to focus on moving forwards. And so this topic is so on point with where I'm feeling in my life, where we don't necessarily have to discount or discredit or disassociate from everything that we've learned or been through. This is our opportunity and our invitation to use all of those things for good as we figure out who we want to become. So real quick, I was recently at this dinner. It was a little mastermind dinner. If you don't know what a mastermind is, it's basically just a meeting of minds where everyone comes together collectively to help each other out. And I have not been in many rooms like that in the past 2 years, as you can imagine. And so it really felt like just this beautiful experience to be seated around people who are passionate, excited about what they were doing. And I noticed this trend within the room that as we went around the room, everyone was introducing themselves, and there was a lot of couples there, a lot of spouse pairs. And the men would generally start talking, and they would share about all these things that they've done and who they are and what they do and how they serve the world. And then at the very end, the women would kind of meekly add in like, oh, I just have this little side coaching thing, or I just am like kind of like an influencer. And it was almost this like apologetic acknowledgement of their identity. And we had a little break while we were waiting for dinner to show up. And I was sitting at one of the tables, and suddenly I kind of noticed all these women were around me. And one of them said, did you recognize that you were the only female who one spoke first, but who didn't shy away from sharing who you are and what you do? And I hadn't noticed that. But this topic today is so powerful because what I found is that so many of us are yearning for that purpose. And we're finding ourselves in this place of like, am I happy right now? Am I content? Am I loving my life, or am I faking to love it? And so I just think it's this beautiful reminder that like wherever you find yourself today, there is always this invitation for you to change the way you show up, but also to re-identify. So one of the things that I've been thinking about so much is a lot of times when we think about our identities, or when we think about like how we want to reinvent ourselves, we almost become apologetic about it. But if we are really going through life as students, which I believe we all are, this invitation to change and grow and evolve should be something that we welcome with open arms. There are so many different versions of ourselves that we are always becoming. And it's our job as a human being to acknowledge our growth and to honor that evolution. It's almost like we can wake up and say, I honor who you're becoming, and I really like this version of you. I literally say that to myself some days. So one of the things that I think is really fascinating is this idea of identity foreclosure. So I had a guest on my podcast and we talked about this. And essentially what identity foreclosure is that a lot of times we stay in things too long that we know are not maybe the right fit or are no longer serving us because we feel like we've already invested time. Have you ever felt that way where maybe you started a degree and all of a sudden you realize, wait, this isn't what I wanted, but I'm already 2 years in and it would be a shame to throw that away? Or maybe you're in a relationship and you have this feeling that this relationship isn't the best fit for you, but that you need to move on, and you're not necessarily honoring that intuition because you're worried that, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to start all over again, or I wasted so much time. Well, identity foreclosure is the exact reason why we hang on to things too long, whether it's jeans from high school that no longer fit us, or degrees that are no longer serving us, or passions that maybe just have not grown with you as you've grown. And so identity foreclosure is something that we really need to evaluate in ourselves. And a lot of times identity foreclosure, in my opinion, is coupled with ego. So let me break this down. I think that our society is really focused and fixated on titles, accolades, and awards. It's things that honor our success, but it's only honored in a way that other people can understand. And so when we look at this concept of identity foreclosure and we couple it with ego, I think that those two things are kind of this natural disaster, the reason why we stay in things too long when we're genuinely yearning for a change. Now, I want to share something with you. So I have been an entrepreneur for 10 years. And in the last 10 years, I have done a lot of different things. So I was a wedding photographer. I was a Midwest wedding blogger. I was a watercolor artist. I had my own little print shop. I started this podcast. I became a public speaker. I created online courses. I did online coaching. I've hosted masterminds. I've done all of these things. And most recently, I added the title author to all of the different things I've done. Now, I have really struggled in times where there are these transitions happening and I cannot communicate exactly what I do or how I show up and how I serve the world. But someone recently asked me, they were like, how are you able to pivot so many different times and find success in so many different places in a 10-year time span? I mean, that's a lot of things that I've done. And the reality is that my identity is not found in my output. My identity is found in who I am. And when we as human beings connect on this human level, it invites us to change and evolve in a way that people will support you as you grow. There's this meme that I just love whenever I see it. And it's like, notice who is watching you and says like, I like this version of you too. Those are the people that you want in your life. And so when we think about this evolution, and if we're in this season of like, I really want to reinvent myself, we need to let go of the ego of titles and things that will express our success. And we need to get back to, what do our values tell us success will not just look like in our lives, but that success will feel like in our lives.
I was really thinking about this topic of reinvention. Reinventing your life, reinventing yourself, reinventing your career, reinventing your relationships, reinventing your state of mind, state of well-being. And I kept asking myself, is that really what we're striving for? And as our community here knows, for any of you that have seen me sort of in these sessions before, I tend to be a bit of a contrarian, or I have an alternate take on a lot of different ideas. And I think my invitation today is to ask yourself, do you really need to reinvent your life? What we're seeing now is this incredible impulse after a number of years where people are feeling stifled and repressed in a lot of ways, and then generations and decades of genuine stifling and repression and oppression. And there's sort of like a pressure valve that needs to be released. And we're sort of saying, I just need to blow everything up and start over. We're seeing it in a really big way in the world of work and careers, which is where a lot of my focus has been, and you cannot listen to or watch or read anything in the context of work or business where the phrase great resignation isn't popping up in some meaningful way on a pretty regular basis now. And so there's this really powerful impulse towards reinvention. But part of my question is that actually the right move for us? And if it is the right move, is it the right first move? Or is it actually much better positioned as the final move in a chain of things that we might explore before we get to the point of sort of like the big reinvention, the big blowing it up, the big disruption? Because that process of reinvention involves a lot of disruption, and it will also very necessarily involve a certain amount of pain, a certain amount of grief, a certain amount of massive recreation, a certain amount of creative destruction in the name of creative construction. And sometimes that's what we have to do to feel the way that we want to feel, right? But I think my invitation today is actually to look at this a little bit differently. And before you say yes to just a wholesale reinvention, an explosion of what is, and a reassembling of the fractal pieces into something profoundly different and new, what I'm going to invite you to do is first think about a series of other things. Think about reframing, think about acceptance, think about savoring, reimagining, and realigning before you reinvent. Embrace a process of waking up, optimizing, and maybe even evolution rather than reinvention. So I want to break that down for you, though. I want to let's talk about each one of these different things individually so you can really get a feel for what I'm talking about. So thinking about how I've gone about this in my life many times over. If you look at what I do now, so as I have this conversation with you, I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I run 2 companies. One of them is a media company, which produces, a top-ranked podcast. A second one just launched today, and other things. I'm an author. I write books and I speak. And I run a second company called Spark Endeavors, which is largely developing intellectual property and training around work and the world of work, the sweet spot, the crossroads between work, meaning, purpose, and joy. And if you look at that, and then if you were to actually look back 25 years into my professional life, you would say, what happened? Because you would have seen me working as a mid-level associate, a lawyer in one of the largest law firms in New York City, like doing corporate work in securities and M&A and working 100 and something hours a week and having absolutely no life and being just all in this world of law and finance. And then if you had looked at me 5 years after that, I was an entrepreneur in the world of fitness and well-being. And if you had looked at me 5 or 10 years after that, I had evolved that into the world of yoga and Eastern spirituality. And if you had looked at me 5 or 6 years after that, I had sold all those companies and been focusing on writing and speaking and teaching and building things. And if you looked at me shortly after that, I had launched this new company called Good Life Project, which is media and community and education. And you would have kind of like from the outside looking in said, oh, he just keeps massively blowing up everything that he's doing and reinventing himself and everything that he's doing in the world. But the truth is, there are a whole bunch of common threads that allowed me to just slowly evolve what I was doing in a much more methodical way. So what from the outside looking in looked like explosion, reinvention, explosion, reinvention, explosion, reinvention, was actually from the inside out, this process of slow and gentle shifts. And I spent a little bit of time deconstructing my own process of optimizing and evolving. And yes, there was the occasional wholesale explosion and reinvention, but I realized that in my life, I probably didn't actually have to do those things. And for most people, they probably don't. So I deconstructed it into a 6-step framework. And I know Brendon's probably smiling because I somehow just create all these different frameworks. It's the way that my brain thinks. So let's talk about these 6 different steps. And in my mind, they happen in this specific order in order to get to the feeling that we so desperately yearn to feel when we talk about reinventing your life. And maybe without having to experience the pain and the disruption of doing something that is just a big blow up nuclear option move. So step 1 is all about awareness. And if you've heard me sharing ideas in our GrowthDay community here, you know that I am a huge advocate for self-awareness, for cultivating self-awareness. The reason for this is that in all of my research in 2 decades now, 2 decades plus into what it actually means, what it takes to live a good life, one of the words that keeps being centered over and over and over and over and over is a good life is an intentional life. But you cannot be intentional unless and until you are aware, right? Repeat that. A good life is an intentional life, but you cannot be intentional unless and until you are aware. What that means is that for us to make choices, to be intentional, to actually create the relationships and circumstances and constructs that fill us, that nourish us, we actually have to be aware of both the world around us, and we also have to be aware of our own inner world, our own inner thoughts, our own feelings and emotions. And most of us aren't. Most of us have some sort of overlay or representation of what we think the world is that we've learned from culture or society or family. And most of us are actually relatively disconnected from our inner world, from our inner thoughts and our inner feelings. And one of the things that is so, so important before we go through any process of evolution or reinvention is that we've got to become more aware of what is truly happening in the world around us. How objective can we get about the circumstances around us? How objective and clear and accurate can we get about the ecosystem inside of us, about our physical well-being, about our emotional and psychological well-being, about our cognitive and creative state of being. And this awareness is the thing that seeds our ability to then be intentional and make decisions and take actions based not on some semi-illusion of what we think is happening, but actually on something that is much closer to the truth of what is genuinely happening inside and outside of us. And the more that we can make decisions and take actions based on clear sight rather than diluted sight, the more likely we are to actually have those decisions and actions lead to the outcomes that profoundly change the way that we move through the world and the way that the world responds to us. So how do we actually cultivate that level of awareness, of self-awareness? There are so many different ways to do it. And you've heard me, our longtime community members have heard me talk about many of them. My personal practice happens to be mindfulness meditation, but it's not just mindfulness meditation, it's a sitting practice daily. And then a lens of mindfulness as I move throughout the day, which happens just to have emerged from, a dozen years of sitting mindfulness practice. But that might not come easy to you. So some other ideas around this, you can do journaling. Journaling is something that can be incredibly valuable in really identifying what's happening inside and outside of you. And fantastically, the GrowthDay app and platform has the functionality to be able to do this right inside of it. You don't have to go anywhere else. You literally don't have any excuse. You can literally tap on a screen and just start jotting down your thoughts.
This can be your day for personal growth. This can be that day you committed to and you remember, you go, that was the day I got myself a community. I got better coaches. I committed to making my life the absolute best that I could. This is that day. Make today your growth day. Click the button on this page and sign up right now.